So hello everybody and welcome to this episode of CFO 4.0. Now with me today on the show is somebody I've been trying to get hold of for a very long time, but he's been a very busy man. So I'm thrilled to have him with me today on the show. So our guest for today is Darren Woods, who is CFO of Freedom Fibre. So lovely to have you on the show, Darren. Thank you for joining me.
Oh, my pleasure. Sorry it's taken so long to get to talk.
No, I'm sure it will be worth it. It'll be worth the wait. So tell us a little bit about yourself, Darren. What's been your journey to CFO and to Freedom Fibre?
Well, first of all, apologies for taking so long for us to get to talk. The main reason being that over the last 6 or 9 months, we've been raising capital for Freedom Fibre, which is a startup altnet. Alternative network is the term. So we're building fibre to the homes across the country. And there are many of those altnets around. Essentially, BT will remove their copper cable at some point in the future, and optical fibre is seen as the replacement for that. So there's a huge competitive landscape now. Lots of businesses looking to build optical fibre into people's homes and businesses to provide them with gigabit capability, because everybody's got Lexas as well as Netflix and all the other things that demand your broadband. So we started a business in March last year. And we raised 5 million of seed capital, which in anybody's books is quite a lot of money. But in this sector, it's a drop in the ocean. So it's essentially an infrastructure business. So it costs a lot of money to build that network. But then at some point, it basically moves to a maintenance or annuity model, and it's there for the next 30 years. So all the capital gets consumed up front. And then really once you've stabilized the business and you've got customers connected, it's just a maintenance model, really. So all of the exciting stuff really happens in the next 5 years. So that's why I've been tied up, and I'm delighted to say that last month we secured a large infrastructure investor, Equitix, that's investing 100 million in our business, and that gives us the oxygen to start to scale the business, which is really exciting. Now,
sounds like a really exciting time for the business.
It's incredibly exciting, and until you live through it, it's difficult really to appreciate what's involved. So. You know, my background when I started in finance, I did a degree in finance and accounting at Portsmouth. Really enjoyed it because I saw it as a way of getting into business, and I enjoyed businesses. A little known fact is that I did my dissertation on why UK companies don't invest in training and development. So I've always felt that people are the difference between a successful business and the also rans. So, you know, everyone looks at accountants sometimes and puts them in a box and says, you're just about numbers. I think really the accountants that develop into CFOs recognize that it's more than just about the numbers. And actually, at the heart of it is always people, really. Businesses are run and driven, and value is created through people. So after my degree, I went into a bathroom manufacturing company, Twyford's, that you might have heard of, and then spent 20 years in manufacturing. And we went through a number of ownerships, and eventually I became the CFO of Sanitec, which is a pan-European manufacturing business that manufactures bathrooms across many European countries. So my first appointment into the CFO role was remarkably scary, actually, because Sanitec is a very large business. We had 1.5 billion of capital, around about 900 million of equity, and about 600 million of debt. And that's a fairly scary place to be in your first step into a CFO role. I remember arguing with my CEO, saying, "I'm not so sure I'm ready for this," and he said, "It's my choice if we pick for the CFO, not you." And so I spent 3 or 4 years, CFO, 3 or 4 years as the CFO of this large organisation with I think 10,000 employees, and we had presence in pretty much every European country. The other interesting point is it was backed by private equity, so it was my first real insight into private equity ownership, and since then I've worked with a number of private equity backers. And then, without boring the listeners about my whole CV, but the only interesting point really is after spending 20 years in manufacturing and having a pretty large CFO role, private equity backed, I then moved into a UK role. So Sanitec's headquarters was in Helsinki. I felt I needed to see my family a little bit. And then I spent 4 years as a CFO at Hewden Stewart, the plant hire business. And they were private equity backed as well. And I enjoyed that, thoroughly enjoyed looking at big yellow diggers and cranes and all those kind of things that everybody sees bouncing around building sites. And I guess the point to note there is that, and interestingly, I've just done a LinkedIn post on this about the fact that moving across sectors can be quite scary. and you feel sometimes that the skills you've learned in one sector never really translate. And I don't think that's true. I think, as my post talks about, you can teach an old dog new tricks. And I think moving sectors allowed me to bring some skills with me, but learn some new skills. And then after that, I spent 4 years in consulting. And this is where people who know me think I had a midlife crisis. So I went into leadership consultancy. So nothing to do with finance at all, actually. I spent 4 years doing coaching, mentoring. I trained and did level A and B psychometrics, so I could do assessments in large organizations and work with some amazing clients like Aviva, the Co-op, Nissan, really large organizations. And it allowed me the opportunity to work at a very senior level and really try to help those senior leaders understand where their strengths and development needs are. And I worked with trained psychologists who've got 20 plus years of psychology experience, but you also need to weave into that an operational perspective. So I did that for 4 years. And then 3 years ago, I was approached to be the CFO at Fibre Nation, which is an alternative network backed by TalkTalk. And that brings me to where I am today, really. Fibre Nation got sold to City Fibre. And then the team that created or were part of Fibre Nation decided to set up themselves. And I'm now kind of founding director and investor in Freedom Fibre.
Wow, what a CV that is, and a real journey. And what's really interesting, certainly to me, is that people and leadership seems to thread its way through those different elements. And I loved your reaction, or your CEO's reaction to your first role. That is fabulous.
Yeah, I did try to talk him out of appointing me at first.
That's that is one way to look at a job. I'm gonna get the job, and then I'm gonna talk myself out of it. But no, what a piece. And what I find really interesting is that you've obviously always had a passion for people and people development, because it started, by the sounds of it, all the way at beginning when you did your degree and with your dissertation as well.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I was always good at maths at school, and you know, careers advice at school is really poor. I'm not so sure it's changed that much, if I'm honest. I've got 3 daughters, and it seems that careers advice through schools hasn't really moved on a pace since then, which I think is a pity, because I think people get pigeonholed. If you're good at maths, you'll be good at accounting or banking, and I think it's a bit more complex than that. So when I went into my degree, I'd got no background in accountancy. I hadn't done that at A level or O level. But I saw accountancy as a way of getting into business. And I think business is fascinating. And as I've said before, I always felt as though, the difference between businesses would be its people. And so my dissertation was really around trying to understand why organizations don't invest enough in people and developing them. And, the answers are relatively straightforward. You've got short-term metrics, share price drives a behavior, and quite often you can improve your P&L by not investing in training and development short term, but then you pay the price long term. So they're not surprising outcomes from that. But I was also fortunate in my period in the manufacturing business, bathroom industry, that we were owned by Carradon to start with, and they invested heavily in a program called First in Service, which was really about equipping all managers and all employees with tools to really make the business as good as possible. So very, very fortunate. In my early 20s, I spent 4 or 5 years going through leadership training and understanding the power of teams. And I think that's always stayed with me as well. So I've been very lucky as well that the organizations I've worked with at the beginning of my career, when you're in your formative years, really supported my view of how organizations should develop. Had I not been as lucky, that might have not been as important part of my career.
Yeah, that is really interesting. So I guess, do you still feel like that companies don't invest? And maybe I'd make it more specific and say finance doesn't invest enough in its skills.
I think actually finance is a great profession. And I think typically the one benefit finance has is that there's a kind of proven route. And typically it's through the benefit of the part qualified and qualified qualifications. So whichever body you're with, whether it's SEMA certified or chartered or AAT, there's a natural structure there which helps organizations and employers to understand people's skills and ability. The problem is I see that as the backbone. I think that's kind of the basics. And I think companies helping employees through that is fantastic. But it's what you do around that. And I think sometimes there's a belief that just the qualifications is enough in order to allow somebody to really develop. And really what you need to put around that is a much broader set of development and training skills, which is largely around exposing people to a little bit of danger. So I've worked with people who, always want to be the leader presenting and always want to be up in front to demonstrate that it's their organisation. I think there comes a point in your career when I've done hundreds of presentations and I've done hundreds of sound bites with investors, and really that's the time when you really need to start putting some of your team in front of that so that they really learn with you as a safety net around them. So I think it's putting some thought into how you can help the people around you to really develop. And usually that's the most important part of that, is putting them, exposing them to the things that you're exposed to. Of course, putting them on courses and where there's a specific need is helpful. So if there's a, negotiating skills course as an example, that can give you some tools and techniques, but actually you learn by doing something and not by watching other people do it. And I think that's probably the most important thing. So in all the teams I've ran, I've always wanted to, first of all, create a feeling that we're in this together. And secondly, allow people to feel as though if they want to progress their career, there's an opportunity to do so by really getting exposure to some of the things I get exposed to. And the old adage is true. I think you should recruit people that are going to try and replace you. I think if you're scared of people kicking you out of the door, I think that's a mistake. I think you really should be looking to recruit those people that will put pressure on the role you're doing, because that will make you better.
Oh no, absolutely. I think that's always something. Certainly when you always want somebody better than you, because it allows you to step back and get on with the next challenge that you've got coming through. So when you're working with, obviously you've worked with a number of different teams, have you seen any common skill gaps? When you've gone in and you've figured out or assessed them, are there some common areas where you've gone, actually, I always invest in this particular area of skill?
Well, I think there's a couple of answers to that. First of all, typically what I try to do is recruit a really good tax accountant, because I think the technical skills around tax is something that you really want somebody watching your back. So I always look to find a really good tax accountant, and I've worked with a few of those. I also try to find really somebody who's very good at treasury. So tax and treasury, I think, are two very important areas. Now, of course, we all want to make sure that the books are balanced and that we've got good governance. But I think those two areas are a skill set. And interestingly, we've just recruited a treasury manager who impresses me immensely. She's just about to start. And we had a debate about, sometimes you get accountants moving into treasury, and it becomes a little bit diluted. I do believe that treasury is a function that, you want people who really enjoy it and treat it as a unique skill rather than a generic skill. So I think those two areas in my past I've usually focused on, because I think they're specialist skills, and I think you want people in your team that cover that specialist base. I think outside of that, I actually think that you're looking for, back to the old Belbin days, if anybody's ever remembers their kind of behavioural science on Belbin, which was about making sure you've got a balanced team. And in Belbin, and this is where my kind of psychologist friends, when I was in consulting, used to scream at me, because Belbin's not very well proven in psychology. But in business terms, it's well liked. And it's well liked because it's simple, really. So, every team should have a balance of skills and a balance of roles. You need somebody who's an ideas person. You need somebody who keeps score. You need somebody who's going to lead. You need somebody who tries to find information and resources and things like that. There's about 7 or 8 skills in there. And I think the same applies in finance. I think you're looking for a balance of skills. We've just recruited somebody who's going to look at our financial modelling, and he won't mind me saying is a bit of an Excel geek and really enjoys converting kind of P&Ls and cash flows in Excel and really helping us to model our business. And at some point in the future, we are a new startup. We'll look to move that off of Excel, but the reality is most accountants now still use Excel. So that's it's a pretty unique role, and we wanted a unique character for that. And then you move all the way through to your kind of financial accounting and your controllers and your business partners, and they all bring different skills. Whilst finance might knit them together from a qualification point of view, the reality is they're extremely different roles. Your finance business partners are people that you want to be able to engage with the rest of the business and be able to. So actually, to some extent, the rest of the business will share all of their hidden secrets to some extent and allow them to understand what's going on. And then at the other end, you do want people in your team who are, so diligent on detail that every T that isn't crossed or I that isn't dotted, they're going to pull you up on it. That's a very different skill set. And you need to get that balance in your team, really. I know, I've recruited, as we started this business, the first person I approached was a lady I worked with 20 years ago who does contracting now. And she's incredibly good at detail, a very good financial accountant in her contracts, and just won't let anything slip under the radar screen. Well, that's what you need when you're kind of starting a business. You can't have something like that trip you up because you're dealing with, sums of money that if you get it wrong, it could quickly put you out of business before you've started. So I think it's just getting that blend. I think it's understanding the blend of skills you need and making sure you recruit for that. And I guess the final point is that in the market today, and we are recruiting a lot, what's interesting is that whilst I'm keen to recruit people to kick me out of my job, the reality is it's sometimes hard to find those people in a very, very competitive market. So we're equally looking at people that are on the development curve. And I think you need a blend of people in your team. I think we talk about kind of red and ambers and, green and ambers. And the green are people that we recruit who can hit the ground running and actually have done it many, many times, have brought the experience with them and can do the job. And the ambers are people that haven't yet done it, but show potential that they could. Now, we want both in our team. If we had a team full of ambers, I'd spend all my time trying to develop them, and that would stop me doing my job, and typically the business would fail. And if we had all the people who were green, then there'd be nowhere to move. And what we're trying to do is get that blend, really, where we recruit people that really do bring potential and probably will be a future leader. And some people who are joining us that essentially are very good at what they do and want to stay doing what they're doing. And that's absolutely fine as well.
And it's quite interesting. You mentioned, obviously, you recruit a balance of skills, but it sounds like some of those attributes you mentioned were also personality preferences. So you said detail orientated. So out of interest, do you balance personalities as well as obviously skills when you're recruiting? Yeah,
absolutely. I think, each person is different. Let's start from there. And you bring different kind of outlook, experiences, skills, and personality profiles with you. And I think it's fantastic because that blend of differences is what brings value into the business. So it would be naive of me just to look at skills because that bit almost detaches the person from the skill set. And I think they come as a package. We all come as a package. So we're looking for people that share a similar mindset, that share, I don't mean, kind of echo chambers now where we all agree that we always agree and everybody says I'm right and all that kind of stuff. Every major decision that we make within the finance organization I've got at the minute, small as it is, I put into the middle of the table and we have a debate about it. Now that doesn't mean that it's a complete democracy. So if there's 3 votes against me and I think it's the right thing to do, then I still take the decision because that's what I'm paid to do. But I am interested in what everybody thinks and I'm interested in them bringing their perspective to the table because quite often it allows you to think and rethink. And when we do, for instance, the month-end review, every finance person is, enjoys the month-end process and, goes through that process 12 times a year, if not 13 sometimes when you class the year end. But, we put the result in front of the whole team and we explain the result and ask around the room what do people think about it. And whether you're part qualified, fully qualified, whether you're in a senior position or a junior position, whether you're doing purchase ledger or accounts receivable, everybody's in the room and I ask around the room, what do you think this means? And what are your views? Because I think, the finance organization needs to understand what the business is doing and what the challenges are and understand what that means, because that's, again, part of developing and understanding across the organization. I hate the fact when you've got conversations going on about business performance, and I don't mean sensitive things now. I mean just general business performance that kind of exclude the wider organization. If they're part of preparing the month end, if they're part of that team, then you should allow them to be part of the full journey, not kind of stop them when it comes to the point where you're reviewing the last bit of the results, because I think then you get people feeling they're part of developing the business. And that comes back to that whole point of, do you look at the personalities as well as the skills? We spend a lot of time on our values when we created Freedom Fibre, probably more time on our values than anything else when we created the website. And we looked at the top 4 people in the business, the founding directors, of which I was one, and tried to distill out of that what it was that drove them and what was important to them. And included in that are things like, keep it simple. So, whatever role you've got, we don't want people using that role and that information as a way of trying to demonstrate that they're more important, and by using language that confuses other people. The reality is that, we bring some knowledge and skills from finance that other people haven't studied. Using that as a lever then to demonstrate that we're more intelligent or we have a position of power is not really in the spirit of a team. So we want things to be simple. Even complex problems you can distill down into a simple point, really. All of the people have loads of energy. So we want people that bring energy, whatever that energy is. And equally, we want people to think about better ways of doing things. That doesn't mean that we're always changing, but it means that we are looking for ways to improve. And importantly, we care. We care a lot, not just about customers, but our employees and our stakeholders. And what that means is that if you see something isn't quite right, even though you might not be able to fix it or address it, then at least talk to somebody who might be able to help, so that we're not walking past something. Now, those are kind of values. Those are things that you can distill out in an interview. Is this something you would do? My biggest challenge at the minute, I'll be honest with you, is we operate hybrid working and lots of people work from home. It's people working more hours than we pay them. So I'm trying to say to people that, we want you to contribute, but we don't want you to work 7 days a week. And that's because we've recruited people that enjoy the challenge in front of them. And we're not now in a sprint, we're in a marathon. We're trying to grow the business over the next 3, 4, 5 years. So we don't want people sprinting themselves to burnout. But it's a nice problem to have in some respects. It demonstrates the fact that we've recruited people that are engaged in the business and want to find ways to make it better. My job, because I'm also responsible for HR in the business, is to make sure that we don't allow them to burn themselves out.
It's always a hard balance, especially with people that are so high performing, is always finding the balance between what is high performing and what is overworking. And I don't know anyone that's got it perfect, and it's just constant monitoring is my personal view on it. As a workaholic myself, I know the signs, and I think that's sometimes the conversation, isn't it, to have with individuals about how do you know when you're on the verge, or you're treading into dangerous waters. So
yes, I agree.
So one of the questions I did want to ask you, because obviously you're involved in HR as well, how do you approach recruiting for the right skills and personalities? Do you do any pre-testing? Do you have a particular approach to recruitment that you favor? Tell us about how you do it.
That's a really good question. And as I said, I spent 4 years in a consultancy business that did personality profiling and assessments. And I'm trained myself, although it's a few years now I've done it, to do personality profiling. If you look at the statistics, just interview alone has a low probability of success. And really, to get to a kind of correlation of 0.67, I remember this from my consulting days, you really need to, which is a high probability, a high positive correlation. You need to really do assessment centers, competency questionnaires, personality profiling, along with interview. So if you go through all of that, you've got a very high probability you're recruiting the right person to drive the business forward or for the role you're recruiting. The problem is that all of that process takes time and a lot of money. And in the current market climate, we just read some research yesterday, actually, that for 70% of the candidates that are being interviewed at the minute, they've already got 2 offers on the table. And if you don't close out the process within a 2 to 3 week period, then they've moved on. Now, in that climate, then if you're in danger of successful operation dead patient, which is we're going through a very deliberate process in order to find the right person. And by the time you think you've got the right person, they've moved on because they've got another job offer. So I'm a huge believer that in a kind of stable market environment, that we would look at a kind of suite of tools that would make sure we recruit the right people. But in the absence of that, you've got to be pragmatic. And I think, certainly in my role and the different sectors and the different owners I've worked with, I think it's important to recognize the environment you're working in. So I think one of the things I've learned over my career is that, whatever worked in one environment doesn't necessarily work in another. And I think it's been having the wisdom to understand that you're working in a different place now. And, so to put that in very simple context, when I was a CFO at Sanitec, we had a team of 200 in finance. So I had lots of resource in order to do things. At Freedom Fibre, there was me and 2 other people. So you can't approach the business in the same way. And, for the first time in 30 years, I was doing bank reconciliations. Now, you've just got to appreciate that you're in a different environment. And where you don't adjust, then you're likely to die. Yeah, I mean, because you absolutely need to just understand that the world has changed. And that means doing things that sometimes are unpalatable or unfamiliar, but jumping into the middle of it because it needs to be done is right. And I think the same here. When we're recruiting, we do use interviews, obviously, in the traditional way, but we use competency-based questions. So rather than just having a general chat, there's a list of questions that we pose, which are really trying to tease out whether or not the person on the other end of the table not just brings the core skills from a technical point of view, but actually thinks like we do. And I stress that isn't means comes up with the same answers as me. It just means has a curious mindset, wants to challenge things, understands that flexibility can mean that I don't really mind if you're dropping the children off in the morning. That's not a problem because we've got the whole day to go at really. So whatever works for you is fine. But understanding that in that flexibility, there's times when I do need something short term because we've got investors that ask for it. But equally, the people in my team sometimes need short term support because they've got challenges with children at school or appointments they can't miss. And I think it's a two-way. And providing we have that kind of understanding, then I think we've got somebody who's likely to add value into the team. Where you've got somebody who has a different perspective, then the chances are they're not going to fit into the environment we're working in. And we don't want to force people to work in an environment they don't feel comfortable.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point because it's also, like you say, it's not just about skills, it's their approach to life, their attitude and how it fits with, because I do think there is a bit about businesses, I think, have their own pace. Yeah. Some businesses are at a rate of knots and constantly changing, and some businesses are very slow and steady, but they get there. It's the whole hare and tortoise conversation, isn't it? But depending on the individual that you are, you need to figure out what pace of life suits you. And some people would rather go through the sprint and go hell for leather, and others, prefer a different pace of change, I think is probably the phrase I'd use.
I think you're right. And I benefited working in private equity. I remember in the first private equity business I worked with, which was EQT, the CEO I worked with had a saying which was in private equity, effectively you go through 1 year in 3 months. And every 3 months, there's this feeling of, right, what's the next challenge? Whereas in a normal business, you might look at it as a challenge for the next 12 months. In private equity, it's the next 3 months. And if you haven't done something tangible in that 3-month period, you're not moving quick enough. Now, I think that's I spent 15 years in private equity. And I think that mindset of how do we create value? And if there is a problem, you move very quickly. You don't sit and debate it. You have to move very quickly. That's part of my DNA. And I think you're right. There are some organizations that isn't part of the DNA. And it would be difficult then to slot into a culture which is moving at a greater rate of knots. There are challenges with that, by the way. So it doesn't come without a price. To move quickly, sometimes you've got to deal with imperfect information. So you've got to make some assumptions without having all the knowledge around you. You can, with the benefit of all the data, you move slowly. So there is a trade-off and kind of ups and downs and pros and cons of both approaches. My view is that, don't let, kind of good be the, perfect be the enemy of good. Because if you're not careful, by the time you've got all the data, the world's moved on. And I think businesses move very quickly.
And for me, one of the key tenets of leadership is knowing what speed you should be moving at, depending on the problem. And because a bit like you said, you can move incredibly quickly, but you also lack the opportunity to course correct. It's a bit like a ship. You can make some big corrections and send yourself off into completely the wrong direction if you're not very, very careful. So I think that's a really great way to look at it.
Yeah, that's a good point. I also think from a CFO perspective, I think there's a point of picking, if you accept that when you're moving quickly, things will go wrong, I think you have to pick and choose when you're going to treat something as serious or important. So, people in my team work very hard, and when we're moving very fast, they're going to make some mistakes. And if you've got to appreciate that those mistakes will be made. Now, if you think there's high risk of a mistake being made, then the best thing to do is to put some support around that, which is typically get somebody else to check the work before it goes anywhere near an investor or a bank. So accept the fact that mistakes are going to be made, and then put some actions in place to protect the business and the individual. But what we shouldn't do as CFOs, I think, is pull people up on mistakes that everybody knew was going to happen at some point, and use it as a way of essentially saying, you need to try harder. I think those conversations are destructive. I think if somebody's not performing to the level you want them to do, I think, first of all, then that's a more rounded conversation in their personal development reviews. And I think also, from a business point of view, it's making sure that you put the right tools and support around them. What you shouldn't be doing, I think, is venting your frustration on somebody who's maybe made a mistake when you're moving at such pace. And I think it's understanding how you address that. Now, there are going to be times when you're dealing with people that are underperforming, and you've got to address that seriously. But I've seen too many examples where certainly CFOs, want to make a point of the fact that mistake's been made and that should never happen again under my watch and that kind of stuff. I find that something that's dating back to the 80s, really. And I think that's destructive. I think, of course, mistakes happen and we need to address them. But I think, CFOs need to be a bit balanced in how they kind of address those kind of issues.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting. I don't think it's just CFOs either. I think there's a style of leadership that you can see across different organizations where it is it's not all right to make mistakes, but that's how you learn, regardless of like you say, the controls and the checks and the mentoring and support you put around people. There is a bit about us being afraid to fail. And as a constant, somebody that likes to learn, I see something very wrong with that mindset. The question is, can you spot the mistake before it becomes a problem, is my personal opinion.
Well, it is. And I think that's where, for me, there's a saying when I started my career, in the really good executive boardrooms, you walk into them, you can't really tell who the CFO is. You can't really tell who the HR director is, or the chief people officer, or the chief engineer, because ultimately they're all business people. And, I think that's a good point. I think really I think the benefit that CFOs bring is that balance and experience that understands that these things go wrong and put things in place to kind of help the organization to protect themselves and protect the business rather than demonstrate their wisdom. I think it's more applying that wisdom to benefit the wider organization.
Yeah, I like that. I really like that. And especially your comment about walking into a boardroom and not knowing instantly who does what role is a really good point. So you talked very briefly there just before we got into that last piece about personal development. So when you're working with an existing team, how do you approach the assessment of skills and personal development, to build the team that you want?
Well, I can give you some tangible examples at the minute. So we're just going through personal developments with my very small team at the minute. There's only 3 members of it. We are recruiting more and they'll arrive during the next 2 months. But we've obviously got structure, as you'd expect. So we do have a HR manager, and she's fantastic at putting some of the things in place that larger organizations have when we're quite small. So we've got the classic paperwork and things that we'd use. The first thing I do is I distill it down into 4 questions. And the 4 questions are what positive impact has this person made into the business since they arrived? What strengths do you see for this person? What potential development is there? And is there any other points you'd like to raise? I then look at who that person works with outside of finance typically, but also in finance on a regular basis. And I try to target management if I can, but not always. And I'll ask them to just give me a couple of bullet points confidentially on that individual. So when I go to their personal review meeting, I've maybe got 5 or 6 people that have pinged me back a couple of bullet points against each of those. And I then put that into a kind of PowerPoint document, unattributed, so that they don't know where the points have come from, and use that as part of the discussion with the individual to say, well, this is the feedback I've received. Yeah. Do you recognize that? And typically 90% of it's positive. It's the 10% of looking at development that then becomes an interesting conversation. And like I said to the people I'm having the review with, the fact that one person has had a view on something doesn't make it right. It just becomes a topic for conversation. Because it is dangerous that sometimes you think because one person has come back with something saying, well, this person never turns up for time on meetings, or this person needs to go on a time management course, if that were the case. That's just one person's view. I think the important thing is to have a wider conversation about, why do you think that perspective might be given? And then take the person away who's attributed it and just talk about the generic point. And what I find from that then is, first of all, it provides some objective feedback for the individual, which they usually appreciate, because you're taking some time and energy to try and solicit some feedback across the business on who they interact with. And it does make for a much richer conversation around, where they're adding value and what more they could do. Now, in addition to that, obviously, from a technical point of view, you don't tend to get that feedback from the rest of the business. So then I'll sit down with the manager, or I'll sit down with the individual and look at, how they're performing from a technical point of view, the areas where they're clearly showing strength and the areas that they're looking to develop. And then we'll, obviously weave that into where do they want their career to develop into, and have a wider conversation around how that might move forward. Typically, and not unusually, qualified accountants who are recently qualified see their career moving very fast. And, by the time I get to the next 5 years, I want to be an FD or something like that. And I think it's having a conversation around, what are the skills you think you might need to move into an FD role, and how do you think you might address those? And quite often, people at the beginning of their career underestimate the non-technical skills, the stakeholder management skills, the wider business understanding of moving into a senior role. And that for me is a valuable conversation then in somebody's development. I've brought in some external input. We've had a rich conversation around what their view is of that. Typically, it's got lots of good praise involved in it, because typically this person, if they're in the organization, is adding value. Otherwise, we should have had a conversation before then. And usually the person leaves feeling quite motivated about what they need to do next.
No, that's a great approach to have. And in terms of those questions, so just for those that are listening that may be looking to add more of a 360 feedback loop, what are the questions that you would ask to the external stakeholders within the organization, so outside of finance?
Yeah, so I mentioned, I think I asked, what's the positive impact this person's made to the business since arriving? Yeah, what are their strengths? What are the development areas, and any other points you'd like to add? And those 4 questions give somebody plenty of scope to be able to provide some constructive feedback. And as I said, it's not attributed. It's just a collective of 5 or 6 responses. But obviously, if 5 or 6 people pick up on a development need, then there's a strong evidence there that we need to really address that. But it doesn't really matter, because it's about having a good conversation. We want a development conversation to be two-way. That's the most important thing. It isn't about ticking boxes to get through a form. It's about having a good conversation.
And you know what? I really love that approach. I've seen so many 360s where they are just onerous for people to work with, as in not just the individuals and the managers, but those outside the organization. And I love that you've distilled it down to 4 really key points. That's really good. I love that. So hence the recap. So, but I did say that at some point, and I thought this would happen, we are going to run really quickly out of time. So I'm going to ask, so what have for those that are either new into role, right, or evaluating their own performance in terms of building a really high performing team, what are your top tips for somebody in that CFO role building out either their first finance team or assessing their existing?
Right. I'm a huge believer that if you're in a CFO role, senior leadership role, I think the first thing is you've got to be comfortable in your own skin. So I think you've got to feel you understand what it is you want to achieve. And I think it's your agenda to start with. Now, that has to fit in with the rest of the business. But I guess my first ask would be that you look at what you're trying to achieve rather than try to adopt somebody else's agenda. And too many times I've seen somebody try to adopt somebody else's agenda. So start with what you think you need to achieve. If you've got to a CFO role, you'll have come through at least one, if not many, finance organizations. And my advice is always, every interaction you have, look at the things that you wouldn't repeat and look at the things you would steal. And I've always done that. I've seen things that I think I will never ever do that because I think that's wrong. And I've seen other things and thought, that's genius. I'm definitely going to repeat that. So look back at your experiences of working with people and just find out the things you don't want to be known for, but the things you do. And I think that's about being comfortable in your own skin to start with. I think the next thing then is be honest with yourself where your weaknesses are, right? My weakness is I'm not a tax expert. Okay. So I always recruit a good tax expert. So I think you need to make sure that you've got your bases covered. And typically that's covering your weaknesses. In any team, in any walk of life, you want to have your weaknesses covered because that tends to be a blind spot. If you're not good at detail, then make sure you've got somebody in your team who's really good at detail. That kind of thing. And I think the third thing is, be open-minded about having a balanced team around you. So my kind of simplistic approach, which is, again, some of my HR colleagues have probably screamed at me, but the green and the amber works for me. Yeah, green is which roles do you need somebody to hit the ground running, and you need them with bringing experience of having done it before. That's important. That you'll know what those roles are. And the ambers are where you want to see people come into the business that are on a development curve, and really they're going to bring value in the future, but they will add a different dimension and diversity to your organization. And I guess the fourth point is, if you can, try to bring a blend from different sectors. So the great thing about finance is that, you can move across sectors. I mean, I've moved from bathrooms to plant hire to telecoms into leadership consultancy. Now, admittedly, the leadership consultancy is a bit offbeat, but if you take the other three sectors, they're completely different sectors. So it's a great fishing pool to go and look at outside of the current sector. But I think those would be my key points, really.
That's brilliant. And thank you so much, Darren, for joining me on the podcast. Do you know what I found fascinating? The fact that you made that jump into that leadership consultancy. I personally think gives you a really unique view on building and managing a finance team. And I think it's, thank you so much for coming on and sharing that knowledge. And I'm listening intently. There was almost note taking happening through this conversation. There's a few things that I've learned through this conversation as well. So I really appreciate the time.
No, thank you so much for your time. And again, sorry for messing you around to get to this point, but I'm glad we got there in the end. So thank you very much.
Oh, no, absolutely. I'm pretty sure our listeners will be saying the exact same thing. It was worth the wait. So if you've listened to this podcast and you have any further questions, I'd love to hear your feedback, actually. One of the worst things about doing a podcast is you actually don't know who's listening or what they think about the content that you produce. So guys, just encouraging you to reach out. If you like this one, tell me. If there's questions you think I should have asked, Darren, let me know. And you never know, I might be able to convince him to come back on the podcast at some point, maybe 6 months.
Absolutely delighted to come back. If ever.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Darren. So for those that is there any sort of content, any resources that you think people listening to this podcast should have a look at? Anything that you think we should share with the audience?
Nothing springs to mind at the minute, I'll be honest with you. And I don't want to just point people to reams of reading and all that kind of stuff. But if you get any questions that come in and you'd like some support on that, I'd be happy to support you on that.
Brilliant. And if people want to learn more about Freedom Fibre and about the work that you guys are doing, where's the best place to find out more?
I'd be delighted if people want to look at Freedom Fibre. We've got a webpage, as you'd expect, so freedomfibre.com. There's plenty of information on there. We're active on LinkedIn. I've got no problem with people linking onto me through LinkedIn. You'll easily find me, I'm sure. And I tend to try and write a small piece on LinkedIn once a month just to share some thoughts. So, happy to get any to input and feedback on that as well. Brilliant. Thanks, Darren. And for those that are listening, I will pop in a link to the website, Freedom Fibre, and of course, Darren's profile. So thanks again, Darren, for taking the time to us today and for sharing your knowledge with us all about building exceptional finance teams.